A baby's world should be filled with lullabies, gentle laughter, and the comfort of a parent's embrace. At just 7 months old, Emmanuel Haro should have been learning to sit up, reaching out with tiny hands, crying only to be soothed with love. But instead of lullabies, his story is haunted by silence. Instead of safety, it is shadowed by tragedy. Emmanuel vanished, and the whispers about what happened to him are darker than anyone dares to admit. Ask yourself this: how does a baby disappear, not in the hands of a stranger, not lost in the chaos of the world, but under the watch of those who were supposed to protect him? And why is everyone so silent about Emmanuel Haro? Before we dive deeper, I want you to do something powerful. If you believe in justice, if you believe no child's voice should ever be silenced, then don't just watch, take action. Hit that like button, share Emmanuel's story, and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because together, across cities, across countries, we are building a community that refuses to stay quiet. Every comment, every share, every subscription is a stand against silence, and Emmanuel deserves nothing less. It was a quiet day in the community, a neighborhood where the sounds of children playing usually blended with the rhythm of everyday life. But on that day, the sound that mattered most, the cries of baby Emmanuel Haro, faded into silence. The date would be etched into the memories of those who lived nearby, though no one knew it at the time. It began like any ordinary moment, the hum of cars on distant roads, the chatter of neighbors, and behind one home, the faint sound of a baby's whimper that had become all too familiar. In that house, behind those closed doors, something was happening that would change everything. Neighbors recall a strange unease, the kind that makes you glance twice at a window, wondering if you really heard what you thought you heard. Then, suddenly, nothing. No more cries. No more sounds. Just a silence that hung heavy in the air, a silence no one wanted to believe would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Emmanuel Haro was only 7 months old, too young to walk, too young to speak, too young to defend himself. His entire world depended on the adults around him. To those who caught a glimpse of him, Emmanuel was just like any other baby, soft eyes that followed movement, tiny fingers curling around anyone who held him. But behind those innocent eyes, there were signs. Signs that something was deeply wrong. Neighbors whispered about the constant crying, cries that lasted late into the night, cries that carried an edge of pain. Some noticed marks on his skin, faint bruises that were brushed off as normal bumps. Others admitted later that they felt something wasn't right but chose not to interfere. Reports could have been made, questions could have been asked, but they weren't. Warnings were there, tiny cries for help, each one a signal that Emmanuel was in danger. But they were dismissed, ignored, or buried under silence. And in the world of true crime, we know this truth all too well: when the early signs are ignored, tragedy is often inevitable. The day Emmanuel disappeared began like any other, or at least, that's what we're told. His parents claimed everything was normal: feeding times, naps, the usual rhythm of caring for an infant. But as the hours unfolded, small details began to unravel. At first, Emmanuel was said to be resting in his crib. Later, the story changed: he was in his father's arms, and then, suddenly, he wasn't. The timeline twisted, shifting from one version to another, until no one could be sure of the truth. When asked, those responsible gave explanations that seemed to contradict themselves. He was safe, he was gone, it was an accident. No, it was something else. What we know for certain is chilling: by the time neighbors realized Emmanuel was missing, it was already too late. A baby, barely old enough to sit on his own, had vanished without a trace. No Amber Alert filled the streets. No frantic search parties combed the area. Just silence, broken only by the confusion of a community that couldn't understand how a child could simply disappear. And as the hours turned into days, one truth became painfully clear: the answers were not outside the home. They were inside. When Emmanuel's disappearance was finally reported, one would expect an immediate, urgent response. A 7-month-old child missing should have triggered every alarm. But instead of urgency, there were delays that cannot be explained away. Law enforcement's first statements were vague. Officers conducted interviews, but their questioning seemed surface level, as if they accepted the first answers given. Critical hours passed, and with each one, the chances of finding Emmanuel alive slipped further away. Neighbors later recalled that no extensive searches were launched in those first crucial days. No helicopters, no dogs, no neighborhood-wide canvassing. Even worse, evidence that could have painted a clearer picture was overlooked. Items inside the home weren't secured properly, reports of constant crying weren't pursued, and suspicious contradictions in the parents' stories seemed to fall through the cracks. It was as if no one wanted to push too hard, no one wanted to dig too deep. And that raises the most haunting question of all: was this a case of simple incompetence, or was there a deliberate effort to keep things quiet? As investigators pieced together fragments of Emmanuel's story, certain details emerged, details that still haunt this case. Inside the home, traces of Emmanuel's belongings remained: his crib, his blanket, his bottles. But what struck observers was not what was found, but what wasn't. No clear signs of forced entry. No evidence of a stranger breaking in. The front door was locked. Windows shut. Which means one thing: Emmanuel did not simply vanish into thin air. Someone inside that house knows what happened. Then came the contradictions. The mother's account didn't align with the father's. Times shifted. Explanations changed. At one point, there were claims that Emmanuel had suffered an accident. At another, suggestions that someone else may have taken him. Yet no footprints, no fingerprints, no trail outside pointed to an intruder. Perhaps the most disturbing of all were the whispers from those close to the family, suggesting Emmanuel may have been harmed long before authorities were called. Bruises on his body, patterns of neglect, and a history of unexplained injuries painted a darker picture than anyone wanted to believe. This evidence, or lack thereof, left investigators and the community staring into a void of silence, where the truth seemed just out of reach, but the weight of suspicion hung heavy over everyone. With the evidence incomplete and the timeline clouded, speculation began to take hold. Was Emmanuel's disappearance the result of a tragic accident, as some claimed? Or was it something far darker, a cover-up of long-term abuse? Some whispered about the possibility of a stranger. A person from outside, slipping into the house unnoticed. But the lack of forced entry and the detailed knowledge of the home made that theory increasingly unlikely. Others questioned the family. Could the very people entrusted to protect Emmanuel have played a role in his disappearance? Contradictions in statements, unexplained injuries, and the father's alleged jailhouse confession raised chilling possibilities. And then there's the theory of systemic failure. Could a combination of neglect, missed warnings, and inaction have created the perfect storm, allowing tragedy to strike unnoticed? Each theory carries weight, and yet, no single explanation satisfies the questions that linger. The truth remains suspended, a puzzle that refuses to be solved easily, and the more we dig, the heavier the silence grows. Perhaps the most haunting element of Emmanuel Haro's case is not just what happened, but what didn't happen. The silence that surrounded him, family, neighbors, authorities, even parts of the media, allowed the tragedy to grow unchecked. Neighbors who heard the cries chose not to intervene. Warnings raised to child protection agencies went unanswered or were dismissed. Even those closest to Emmanuel often turned away, unwilling or afraid to confront the truth. Each moment of silence became another link in the chain that led to his disappearance. And this silence is not neutral, it is complicity. When people close their eyes to suffering, when officials fail to act, when whispers are ignored, tragedy finds space to unfold. Emmanuel's story, in many ways, is a mirror to society itself. A reminder that ignoring pain doesn't erase it, it amplifies it. Tonight, as we examine every fact, every confession, and every unanswered question, remember this: silence is not protection, it is part of the story, part of the tragedy, and part of the guilt that surrounds Emmanuel Haro. Today, Emmanuel Haro's case remains shrouded in uncertainty. His father, Jake, is under intense scrutiny, and a jailhouse confession to a planted inmate has sent shockwaves through the investigation. He allegedly admitted that Emmanuel's death was an accident and that he buried the baby in secret. Yet, the body has never been found. Law enforcement continues to piece together timelines, review witness statements, and examine every inconsistency. Courts are involved, lawyers debate the credibility of the confession, and the community watches, desperate for answers. And still, the questions remain: where is Emmanuel? How could warning signs be ignored for so long? Will justice ever truly be served? The case teeters between investigation and cold case, between evidence and speculation, leaving a community, a nation, and the world to grapple with the haunting absence of a child whose voice can no longer be heard. Emmanuel Haro was just a baby. 7 months old. Fragile. Innocent. Completely defenseless. He never got the chance to laugh, to play, to grow, to live a life he so clearly deserved. And yet, his story has been reduced to whispers, contradictions, and a haunting silence. But silence is no longer an option. The world must remember Emmanuel. His story must not fade into forgotten news cycles or overlooked headlines. Every comment, every share, every subscription to this channel is a stand against the indifference that allowed his cries to go unheard. Today, we ask you, where do you stand? Will you be a witness to silence, or will you be a voice for truth and justice? Share Emmanuel's story. Comment where you are watching from. Subscribe and join a community that refuses to let tragedy be ignored. Because Emmanuel cannot speak for himself, but together, we can amplify his voice. Together, we can demand accountability. Together, we can fight the silence that threatens to bury the truth. And together, we honor a life that was stolen too soon. Never forget Emmanuel Haro. Never forget the cost of silence.